Welcome, everybody. I'm very excited to have this conversation about Dayton Jewish history with Marshall Weiss. Marshall, welcome.
Rabbi Drew, thank you, and welcome to all of the folks at Cedar Village, and particularly to those Dayton expatriates who are down there. As you well know, Dayton is the center of the Jewish universe. We're just going to explain to the rest of the uninitiated why today.
Wonderful, wonderful. For those less familiar with Marshall Weiss here, he has spent the last quarter century with the Dayton Jewish Observer as the editor. And as you can, there you go, there's the paper. And as you can see in the wall behind him, he's won multiple awards for his writing from the American Jewish Press Association, amongst other groups, I imagine.
Yeah, there's always room for more.
There we go. There we go. And what brings us here, what brings Marshall here today, is that he has published one book and will be publishing another later this year on Jewish history of Dayton, right?
Right.
So for those interested, he has a 2018 book he published called The Jewish Community of Dayton, which is, oh, there we go.
There we go.
And for those who like pictures, it's got a lot of them.
Yeah, it's my kind of book. It's all pictures with captions.
So it's very accessible. And then for those interested, in just 9 months from now, 8 months even.
That's a great way to put it. It's in gestation.
Yes. In less than 8 months. It's already in the first trimester. And 8 months from now is his next book called Stories of Jewish Dayton. So for those who like, not necessarily not liking pictures, but like reading more, like stories, that book is for you. So I'm very excited to have Marshall Weiss here with us today. So, you know what? I'm just going to start off with, I think, one of the most interesting questions, and then I think we can dive more deeply, which is, so what, actually, you know what, before I was going to ask you about unique highlights, but I'm going to save that. How did you get started with this project? Not everybody wakes up and says, I want to study the history of Jewish Dayton. How did you get started?
Well, when I first came to Dayton 25 years ago to start the newspaper, people would make a point to tell me their perspective, their perceptions on background, the history that led to this point. And as a journalist, you're taught, if your mother tells you she loves you, as I'm sure you know, Drew, you check it out. So, some of these stories had a seed of truth, some of them not exactly, some of them, kind of got better with age. But any kind of journalism you're doing, before you can understand and explain where you are, you need to know how you got there. And very early on, I started digging into the history of this Jewish community. It's a Jewish community that I love very much. And I wanted to find out for myself what happened and how we got here, because that explains the stories that we're putting out now. So the first, my first really serious experience digging into the history was back in 2010. It was the centennial of the Federation here from 1910. Going back a few years before that, we thought, well, we should really do something special for the centennial. What we found was that the archives for the Federation, not many organizations really carefully think about preserving their materials. Basically, everything was in piles in the basement of the Jewish nursing home, which was owned by the Jewish Federation. So we had to take a step back. We brought a member of the Jewish community in who's a professional archivist. Pamela Schwartz is her name.
Oh, wow.
Her husband has family in Cincinnati. And between the two of us, we brought in graduate students to properly preserve and organize into a formal Federation archives. This was about 2008. So we had time to kind of get a handle on what it was we had, what was important, and how we can present this information. Ultimately, that ended up out at Wright State University, where it is today, that archives. But I was able to take from that and do an extensive series on kind of decade by decade, 10 decades of Tzedakah in the Dayton Jewish Observer, and also an exhibit on the Federation's decades of service and what it was doing. So that was really my first experience drilling deep into the history of the Federation. And then from there, I thought, what about a book about the history of the whole community? And I had really hoped to get on that pretty much right after we were celebrating the centennial of the Federation. but you may remember that was just a few years into the recession that hit at the end of 2008, and all hands on deck. I'm a one-person operation, so I really had to focus on keeping our paper afloat, which I did. And then probably about 2015, 16, I was finally able to get back to this project, digging into all the synagogue's archives and trying to sit down and interview, get oral histories with the oldest people in the Jewish community, and then finding oral histories going back a generation from the Jewish community, meeting with as many people as I could, looking through their old photos, of which, nobody organized. It's just, oh, I have them right here, take a look, to put together basically a visual history of our community. And it all ended up being Jewish Community of Dayton. I was hoping for a more dramatic, poetic title, maybe we're the Gem City, in the Gem City of the Golden Land, but the publisher, the great publisher, it's Arcadia, they said, no, people need to know what it's about. Hence, so, okay, you can't miss it, Jewish Community of Dayton.
It's straightforward.
Exactly. And really, it's the first history of Dayton's Jewish community. Almost as soon as I finished that book, I wanted to write another book, because once you find different things, you can kind of drill deep into a wormhole. Like, wait a minute, that's really interesting, and one discovery leads to the next, leads to the next, to the next. And I've spent quite a bit of time at the American Jewish Archives with my friends over there, Gary Zola, who is amazing. Learning more about the history of our Jewish community in Dayton. So many of our leaders over the century have entrusted the archives with their materials, or their children have. So a lot of information is down there. And the archives we have out at Wright State as well. Dayton Daily News Archives, which is also out at Wright State. So it's been fun. And it also helps me in my work with the paper, because these things that I learned from 100 years ago in so many ways inform what we're writing about today.
It provides a historical context.
Exactly. One example of that would be looking back, now that we're in the middle of this pandemic, who knows what stage we're in, but going back to 1918, 1919, and looking at how Dayton's Jewish community navigated the Spanish flu then. What were the challenges? What were the issues? How did the community express itself? And in so many ways, there are very many similarities. In other ways, there are differences. But it's
so let me ask, what are some of the key salient differences and and similarities between these two pandemics?
Similarities, when it first started, the public health professionals were saying, this will be over in a week or two. This will be over in 2 or 3 weeks. And then going from there to shutting down everything and saying, okay, another month. And then opening it up again and closing it up again. That was a big similarity. A big difference was that when the Spanish flu hit during near the end of World War I. And one of the reasons that the Spanish flu unfortunately took off as a pandemic was because of the movement of troops, and the movement of U.S. troops across Europe, across the United States. There's evidence that actually started at a military base in the United States. And it was called the Spanish flu as kind of a misnomer. Spain was one of the few countries where the press was not censored during the war. And when there was a breakout in Spain, it was reported, as opposed to other nations where it wasn't reported, it was underreported. So there's the association calling it the Spanish flu. But with the trauma of people sending their boys off to the war, and in Dayton, I think it was about 100 men were sent off to the war. On top of that, then you've got the Spanish flu, which, of those who were killed in World War I, the American troops, at least half of them died of Spanish flu. It was that high. So you have a war going on, and quite honestly, I think the end of the war, in many ways, kind of outpaced the news coverage of the Spanish flu. Plus the fact that it's very possible the government was kind of strongly discouraging kind of heavy news coverage of the Spanish flu at the same time. So it was a little different. There were not so much necessarily that I know of in Dayton, but places like San Francisco, there were coalitions of people who were anti-mask, who refused to wear masks. So, we think this is new. It's not so new.
Yeah. the more things change, the more they stay the same.
That's true. That is true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. So they had the masking piece of it.
Yeah. I mean, the other interesting thing in Dayton was, and for a small window of time, Spanish flu seemed to hit Dayton a few weeks right after the high holidays in 1918.
Yeah.
So you got the high holidays. A few weeks later, the Spanish flu starts to hit, and Dayton is closed down for the month of October. For a brief period in November, things open up. Middle of November, people think this thing is over. We've licked it. It's not the case, but for a brief period, everything's opened up, which also coincides with the end of World War I, November 11th.
Mm-hmm.
What are people doing? They're celebrating. They're going out in the streets and they're celebrating. Doesn't make things better. What's interesting is in that period when Dayton was opened up, the Yiddish theater actress Sarah Adler was here in Dayton, and she gave 3 Yiddish performances. And the Jewish community's reaction, they couldn't believe that it was really Sarah Adler, the great Sarah Adler, whose husband was Nesher Gadol, the great eagle, Jacob Adler. They thought it was a fake. And the Jewish newspaper here, no, this is really Madame Adler. And she's glad to be here. And she's doing these performances because she knows how rare a treat it is in a place like Dayton. You don't get much Yiddish theater. So she did 3 performances. One performance got very few people because it was on Armistice Day. It was on the 11th. So she came back and did another 3rd performance. So it's interesting that you've got this great celebrity here when all of these things are happening too.
Wow. So you had mentioned that Jewish Federation of Dayton was created in 1910. I imagine Jewish settlement in Dayton began 19th century?
Yeah, really. The first, I know in Cincinnati, the first Jews who came to Cincinnati, I believe, were British. They were English. There were a few of them. And then the German Jews came in. So too, here in Dayton, the first Jews that we know of to settle in Dayton came in the 1840s. Mm-hmm. And they were the German Jews who probably came up here. We don't know for sure, but they probably came up here from Cincinnati. And by way of probably Bavaria. And there was still, even in the period of the Enlightenment, there was still some pretty heavy anti-Semitism in what was not yet kind of the German nation, but in these little municipalities, principalities. Mm-hmm. So they were limited to how many Jews could get married each year, where they could live, what kind of jobs they could have. So they came to Cincinnati, a lot of them. They loved Cincinnati. There was an association with the beautiful land and, the solid established German community, but some of them came upstream. There was one particular founder in Dayton, Joseph Lebensberger. He was the first that we know of to permanently settle here, really established the Dayton Jewish community in 1850. There were enough men here for a quorum. There were 12 men who established what they called the Jewish Hebrew Society. Mm-hmm. A year later, he bought a plot of land for a cemetery. And a year later, they changed their name and became a synagogue, B'nai Yeshurun, which is now, or is B'nai Yeshurun? However I pronounce it, it's probably the opposite, which is kind of sons or children of the righteous. And now it's Temple Israel here in Dayton. So, right, the German Jews and they did well. They were merchants. Within a generation, they did very well. The general community, non-Jewish community, at that point was very intrigued in them. There were enough Germans here who weren't necessarily Jews that they connected with. They were respected. They had a seat at the table in the general community as well as leading the Jewish community.
Oh, nice.
And then, just like so many other Jewish communities, we get the great wave of Eastern European immigration in the 1890s, 1880s.
Before we get there, did the Civil War affect the Jews of Dayton much?
There's not much documentation on a divide as such, or a stance of the Jewish community. Mm-hmm. What I can tell you is that one of the very successful businessmen in this community, he was the first distiller of whiskey. He was a whiskey wholesaler in Dayton. His name was Pollock, Isaac Pollock. He was the first whiskey wholesaler, and then ultimately he becomes a distiller. His name is Isaac Pollock. He's in partnership with another Jew from Central Europe. Rao is his name. So
the first distiller in Dayton at all?
Or
or just
I
the
don't know
first
if he was
Jewish
the
one?
first distiller in Dayton, but they were the first whiskey wholesalers. They were the first wholesalers of whiskey.
Huh.
I don't know if he was the first distiller in Dayton, but definitely the first Jewish distiller. But anyway, it's they start their business, Pollock and Row, in 1859. In 1862, Pollock joins the squirrel hunters in Cincinnati, which your folks may or may not know about. Apparently, there was a general in the Confederacy attempted to attack Cincinnati in the Civil War. This was in 1862. You don't hear about it because nothing really happened. What happened was the Northern armies were in the South, and the North was effectively unprotected. And this is, a year before Gettysburg, and a general was trying to come up and take a northern city, which is Cincinnati. The governor, you've got quite a few Ohio men who were in the field with their, the different divisions of the army. Governor Ohio calls all able-bodied men to come from all over the state to defend Cincinnati. So about 50,000 able-bodied men come to Cincinnati, and our man Pollock is one of those. Now, what you have to keep in mind about these guys these are not people who, for whatever reason, chose to enlist or somehow got out of any kind of conscription or draft to be in the Union Army. Yeah. So these were not the people who went out at first. Yeah. So I don't know if I would necessarily use the word hero, but it was famous. 50,000 men are in Cincinnati. So the Confederates don't attack. They go home. I think he attained the rank of colonel. So it was famous. It saved the city. It's kind of like if you ever watched, or anybody who watches the Gilmore Girls, how the town, Stars Hollow recreates the night that the Revolutionary soldiers guarded it against attack and nothing happened. So anyway, but it shows that he may not have been among the first to support the Union, but and actually, my understanding is he was a Democrat. And he was in with the Copperhead congressman from Dayton, Vallandigham, who was anti-Civil War. But when it came to the Confederates attacking our land up here, they stood up and stood their ground. So Temple Israel's building was dedicated during the Civil War, in the middle of the Civil War, 1863. This was the Hebrew Society, then B'nai Yeshurun at the time. They bought a Baptist church in the middle of Dayton, refurbished it, and opened it in 1863. There were about 70 Jews in town at the time. And Isaac Mayer Weiss, the architect of Reform Judaism, made a point to come up and help with the dedication.
Oh, wow.
What I also found out in my research, and I always wondered about this, were the first members of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, which I believe was 1873, were they the ones that were geographically closer to Weiss and Cincinnati? And the answer appears to be yes. Oh, wow. Of the charter members of that in that first year, the vast majority of them were closer in. I mean, there are some exceptions, but for the most part, these little places, Dayton at the time, Piqua, as also Springfield, I think Lima may have been in it, but there was something to be said about the fact that Isaac Mayer Weiss was a great influence because he was physically close. And his rabbis in training were able to take the trains and kind of get out nearby. So that certainly boosted the Union of American Hebrew Congregations in its earliest days.
Oh, wow. Wow. And then the Eastern European Jews come in. In the 1890s, right? The late 19th century. And of course,
anybody who grew up in a big city on the East Coast, how did they get here? What's going on? How did Jews get inland? And some of your folks who might have read up on their Jewish history will know that even in the smallest towns across America, there was always at least one Jewish merchant. I think there was even a book called The Jew Store about that.
Oh, really?
That Jews, basically what happens with immigration, and this was also with German immigration, unless you knew somebody who set up in a city and said, come, you tried something in a particular place. If it didn't work, you tried it somewhere else. If that didn't work, you tried again. And there was so much of that. There were people who came to Dayton, some of the founders of these original congregations who A few years later, they moved on because it didn't work out. But
Oh wow.
that was definitely true of Dayton. But in the with the great immigration of Eastern Europe after 1881, after the assassination of the Tsar and the pogroms and the May laws, the Eastern European Jews make their way to Dayton. By 1894, there are enough Lithuanian Jews, there are enough Litvaks for them to establish their own congregation. Basically, it's the classic, how our congregations form, the one you go to, and then there's the one you never set foot in. So when the Reform Temple B'nai Yeshurun fully adopts Isaac Mayer Weiss's reform adjustments, and this is 1873. You've got a choir that's mixed, men and women singing. You've got families sitting together. There's an organ. This does appear to be too much for some of the German Jews, and it appears they break away and form what's called House of Jacob, which is an Orthodox congregation. Very unlikely there would have been Eastern European Jews here in the middle of the 1870s, because there were only 10,000 Eastern European Jews here in this country in the 1870s.
Oh wow.
So they're probably teetering along. And then when the great wave of Eastern European Jews come in, they seem to start to flourish in the late 1880s, Beth Jacob, probably because of this influx of Orthodox from Eastern Europe. And then there's enough Lithuanians here that in 1894, we're going to do it our way. We're going to do it, the Baal Shem Tov, not the Baal Shem Tov's way, but the Vilna Gaon's way. That kind of a distinction that people don't even recognize today. So, right, you've got the German Jews downtown, and they're doing very well, and they have their own private German Jewish club. And then you've got the Eastern European Jews in these two congregations, which are on Wayne and Fifth and Wayne, which is kind of in East Dayton. And the Federation is formed in 1910 by the German Jews who want to help out their the Eastern European brethren, who are coming in two generations. And that's the
impetus for the Federation.
That tends to be how Jewish federations form. The first federation was, I think, in the 1890s in Boston. And basically it was, the German, for the most part, the German Jews had made it. They'd come in a few generations before, and now they're established merchants. And the very impoverished Eastern European Jews come in. They're extremely poor. They are not well educated. They're not literate. The German Jews who came in had a bit more education coming from Germany in the midst of the Enlightenment than these guys did. So, of course, you take care of your own. You have to help your own. I don't know if you can hear that coming through the other wall.
A little bit. It's a truck, right?
It's going to stop in like a minute, but this is the one problem with recording here. I am in the lower level of the building, and it's got, I think the boiler room is on the other side of me. So,
where is the office located?
It's the lower level of the Federation's building in Dayton. It's the Boonschaft Center for Jewish Culture and Education. That's the name of the place.
Oh, the Boonschafts are Jewish?
Oscar Boonschaft. Boonschaft School of Medicine is at Wright State.
Oh, wow.
Boonschaft Museum of Discovery is the Kids Science Museum here.
So we've been to that museum. And at Boonschaft, I didn't know that it was Jewish.
Yeah,
donation.
There's even a school. There's a Boonschaft School of Nursing as well. Yeah, it was
really?
Oscar. So it's right. It's 1910, and the rabbi of B'nai Yeshurun, which is the German Jewish congregation, brings his leadership together to form the Jewish Federation. And essentially, there's kind of two prongs to it. There's the local and there's the national. Locally, they are going to provide for those Jews in need. They're going to provide coal. They're going to provide food. They're going to provide rent assistance. They're going to provide interest-free loans to help them get started in business. And this is for the Eastern European Jews. Within about 2 or 3 years, they're going to ask the leaders of the congregations, the House of Jacob and House of Abraham, the Eastern European congregations, to send representatives to be a part of the Federation as well, to sit at the table. One of those congregations agrees, the other doesn't respond. And part of this is something that you see in a lot of communities. There is some resentment on behalf of the Eastern European Jews at getting, even though, a lot of them are very poor, there's pride, there's dignity at getting handouts from, the German Jews. I mean, these are necessary things, but, there are some people who would rather die than take something. I'm not one of those. Or, they'd rather try to provide for their own community than be a burden or, be accused of being a schnorrer. So there's definitely that tension. And the divide, which who even remembers today? Essentially, the things that seem to bring fade the divide away are crises, unfortunately. Nothing like a crisis to bring the Jewish community together. And these come, first of all, in the form of the Great Flood of 1913, which Cincinnati also had a flood, but here it was awful, awful, awful. And that brought everybody together, all classes of people throughout Dayton. The different parts of the Jewish community worked together as well. And then the First World War was the second one, when you got everybody's boys going off to Europe. Everybody helped, whatever they could, to send the boys and to help out any Jewish boys who were stationed here at Wright Field. So those were really the kind of the first levelers, as it were. And of course, that continues throughout, especially when you get into the age of the Holocaust and the establishment of the State of Israel. Those distinctions are few and far between. They're pretty much long gone.
Yeah.
I just gave you the whole history of the Federation on one foot, or on one seat.
Right. So how does you just mentioned the middle of the 20th century occurrences? How did World War II and then after the World War II, the establishment of the State of Israel, and the Holocaust, of course, how did those affect the Jewish community, or vice versa? How much were they able to be involved with the efforts, and then also how did it affect them?
Well, just like so many Jewish communities around the country, there was a level of frustration because they saw what was going on in Germany.
Actually, what about the Depression? How did how did the Depression affect the Jewish community in Dayton?
Well, there was so little money to go around that, unfortunately, the Federation had to really kind of tighten who it could service and who it couldn't service. So, for example, going back to the 1920s, the Federation always had a preschool. And nowadays, we think of a preschool as, okay, maybe it's a luxury for those where both parents happen to work, so it's a convenience for them. But in those days, if both parents had to work, what do you do with your child? What do you do with your kid? It's not like preschool is readily available. You've got to have some place to go, somebody to take care of your child. Wow. So that was what a preschool was first and foremost. So during the Depression, they had to restructure it as an emergency preschool. So if you truly had an emergency, if you had no one else who could take care of your child, then of course we will take care of your child. Again, because of the financial, just the tightening of the finances. There were congregations here that could not afford to pay their rabbis. There were congregations here that were really stuck with their mortgages to the banks. One clever leader of a congregation here was House of Abraham, who he still had some money. He was doing all right. Basically, he bought shares in the bank, which were like at a penny for what they were going before. So he bought major shares in the bank so as to alleviate the mortgage of the congregation. He was able to kind of take care of it in like, two components. Yeah. What the Federation would also do is there were a few times a year when they would take all the kids. There were major donors who would pay for all the Jewish kids in the community and all the non-Jewish kids who were being serviced at the center to go out on outings and picnics and swimming, and they would give them sandwiches, and this was like a big special treat. And they were named after those who funded them. So there was a donor in the community, the Sanders family. So it was Sanders Day. You go to the park and play ball and swim and get food, and this was a big deal. And the other one was Thal, I think Sam Thal. So it's Thal Day. We get to do that.
Nice.
Right. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. I was going to talk about the 1920s and 1930s and Prohibition, but I'll let you finish.
Oh, that's fun. Yeah, the only other thing that I was going to add to the Depression was um, ever since the Federation was established, there was always an issue of transients. Back in those days, there were itinerant Jews, and this was just like in Eastern Europe, poor Jews who were always poor Jews who would go to one community and they would ask for money and a meal and a bed overnight, and then they would go on to the next community.
That's such
And
an interesting cultural
yeah,
carryover from Eastern Europe.
I found so much of this. It's, it's the obligation that Jews have to provide tzedakah.
Yeah.
It's an obligation. So
Yeah.
when somebody comes and they need something, you provide for them. So these are, people would come to town. They would oftentimes ride in the rail cars, like, I hate to use the word, but hobo, like a Jewish hobo, come in. A lot of times they come in at night. So somebody would have to give them a place, to sleep, a kosher meal, a few bucks to get to the next stop. And in and of itself, the Jewish community was willing to take care of, transients. This was just the way it was. There's even the congregation in Piqua. They had a line in their ledger. This is going back to the 1920s. And the line actually says schnorrers, like how much they in this quarter allotted to schnorrers.
Wow.
But the issue was
was that limited to just the Depression? That really didn't.
No, it actually, I don't know when it started, but I know for sure, looking at the 1910 Federation minutes and then throughout, I actually have a story in the next book about aid for the transients. The issues they had was when the transients would double dip, when they go to the Federation.
Yeah.
And then they'd go to this congregation, and then they'd go to that congregation, and then they'd go to the home of this rabbi, and they double, triple, quadruple dipping. And then transients from other communities would hear that, this is the place to come to Dayton. So the organizations repeatedly over decades tried to work it out so that there was no double dipping. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But the number of transients just significantly increased over the Great Depression. And previously it had been people who were professional transients who, they weren't interested in working. If somebody said, okay, hey, I'll take care of you, but would you, deal with this wood pile over here? That wasn't what they were about. But in the 1930s, the transients you get are people who are looking for work, and they happen to be Jewish, and they're going to come to the Jewish community, and they're looking for work. But meanwhile, here's some food and here's some money. And then the other kind of transient that appears in significant numbers once we enter World War II are men who were looking for work, industrial work, in the buildup during the war. They're coming here because there's a base and they're looking for work. Even though they're not skilled for that work, they're still coming here. So this was an issue until really after World War II. It trickled. You still have some transients in the 50s, 60s, even 70s. Now maybe there's like one every 2 or 3 years who will come through of that ilk. They tend to be from and this is just what they do. And, oftentimes they'll come by bus, they'll get a bus ticket, and, Jewish Family Services will maybe give them a card that they can redeem for something at a pharmacy. But there were in the 1930s, hundreds a year, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of transients. So just, and I just thought this is such a lost piece of history that it's interesting. It's interesting to document it and how they tried to navigate it. And I don't know that they ever solved it. It's just this phenomenon just particularly faded away. The other fun story related to transients was the rabbis who lived in the old Jewish neighborhood, they would move out, they would die. And the people who moved in, who were not necessarily Jewish, they would get knocks on their door from these elderly, Orthodox bearded men, and they had no idea what was going on. And this is, like, can you tell me who this person is? And that was kind of residue of the story as it was. So.
Wow. So you meant we're in the 1920s, 1930s. This is also an interesting era in the history of America. Prohibition. So how did the Jews navigate this? Because I don't know if people listening to this know this as well, but synagogues were given dispensation for Kiddush wine for the Passover Seder. So how did but also Jews sort of, there were lots of loopholes too, right?
This is such a fun topic. And this is actually going to be another chapter in my book. Now Ohio entered prohibition early.
By the way, I just want to make a note to everybody. I don't know the title chapters. This is not meant as a plug,
I
but it's a convenient plug.
it tells me that
for
somebody's
plug.
interested in the things that I happen to cover. This is great. No, I
Oh,
appreciate
great.
it.
Great.
Ohio was so passionate about becoming a dry state, very
Really?
conservative.
Protestant? Was it
state.
heavily heavily Protestant?
There's this myth in the United States. There's a myth that Protestants traditionally in America abstained from alcohol, that it goes back to the Puritans. And we know that that's not true. In fact, for safety and sanitary reasons, we know the Puritans drank alcoholic beverages at every meal. It was safer than water. I mean, even breakfast. It's not true. It's a myth. It's a myth about Protestant Christian temperance. But the Prohibition movement goes back decades before Prohibition starts. And Ohio goes into Prohibition midway through 1919. States are required to go into Prohibition as of, I think it's the second or third week in 1920, but we get extra credit because we're so eager to be dry that we, by the way, and there was some prohibition going on in World War I because of scarcity of grain,
rations.
scarcity of products. So that was happening, and it just seemed to be kind of a natural byproduct. But as Rabbi Drew says,
it's also byproduct of women's suffrage.
Yeah. Women's suffrage, prohibition,
also
and
anti-German sentiment.
The pseudoscience of eugenics are
really?
all tied together. Are all, the word intersectionality did not exist going back 120 years ago, but there was an intersectionality among these movements, and what was perceived as kind of, the real Americans, the good Americans, the Protestant product of the Mayflower. When people use the terms Native Americans back in the 1910s, teens, 20s, and they were not referring to the indigenous populations of America. They were talking about the Anglo-Americans who started coming here with the Mayflower, a totally different meaning. So all these things are in many ways, they're kind of aligned in this weird dance. But
another thing that I've heard is also a lot of the breweries were German run, and there was a lot of anti-German sentiment throughout World War I. So it was easy to want to shut them down.
Oh yeah, no question about that. So many characters go into play. Yeah. But what people don't realize, and I'm going to take a step back, is that in Eastern Europe, it was the Jews in Poland who ran the alcoholic enterprises. Now, there is no way that the princes, that the nobility in Poland would ever want to give the Jews of Poland a leg up in any way, unless there was no other way that they could solve a financial problem. And Jews were able to really get grain, Polish grain, to different markets because they knew Jews in other countries. And without painting too broad of a brush, Jews had a reputation for not being great drinkers. They really didn't drink the profits. So what happens is these Jews start managing crops. They're doing import of crops. Jews are making beer. They're making whiskey. In France, after the Enlightenment, they're actually in the wine business. Jews, of course, are not supposed to own anything, but they are the ones who are leasing the bars. They're running bars in cities and towns and villages. So Jews were very heavily involved in every aspect of the liquor business in Poland. So it's no surprise that when they came over here, that you would find them, some of them made big successes in the whiskey business and the liquor business, not so much in beer, but there's significant families that go back in Cincinnati and in Lexington. And this was also the case with our guys here, Pollock and Rao, our buddies Pollock and Rao. Oh, yeah. So in 1919, when Prohibition comes into Ohio, it's not Pollock and Rao, it's Rao and Sons. Rao changes his business. At least it's called, it's in the Dayton City Directory, where it had been wholesale liquor distributors, distillers. It is now manufacturers of non-alcoholic beverages. So
don't look at us. We're not doing anything illegal here.
Well, I've contacted as many Ralph family members as I could. So, because I wanted to know, okay, do we have any proof that, they were just kind of skirting, they were still doing the real deal and this was a front? And 201, they all said, we don't know. We never asked. I wish we knew, because this is really cool and this is really fun.
Yeah.
So it may have been. The next year, I think it's 1920 in the Dayton City Directory, it's Rao Tires, automobile tires, in the same location. So again, I don't know if he switched businesses altogether or if this was just a real front for what was going on behind the scenes. But we're going to hit the pause button on Rao for now. Yeah, there were a number of loopholes when it came to Sacramento wine. This is a fun story. By the way, if you're interested, bear with me here. The book on this, and Drew, you may be familiar with this. The book on this subject is Jews. That's not the book. I'm sorry. We'll have to cut that out. Here's the book. Now my books are going to fall. The definitive book on this topic is Jews and Booze by Marnie Davis, and she's out of Georgia. Right, because so in order so that you're not infringing on religion, which would be a violation of the First Amendment clause, the fact that Catholics, many Protestants, and Jews require wine for our religious purposes. Christianity sacrament, for us, it's Kiddush. Whether it's for Shabbat or Havdalah, or for the bris, or for the wedding, or for all the holidays around the year. Those who are putting this law together, I believe it's the Department of Labor and maybe the Internal Revenue Service at the time, have loopholes that you can have, each individual can have a certain amount of sacramental wine per year. And there's a few different ways to obtain that. You can make it yourself, which Jews and Italians did. You can make it with grapes. A very common practice with Jews, if you couldn't get fresh grapes or the right grapes, you could also use raisins. There were big sales on raisins in the weeks leading up to Prohibition in the Jewish community, in the newspapers, the markets in the Jewish community. Or, and this is where it gets tricky, there were authorized dealers of sacramental wine. And I know that there were two in Cincinnati in the 1920s, one of which was a member of the Manischewitz family. This was way before Manischewitz had its own wine, but it was one of the Manischewitz family opened a store. I think it was on Central Avenue, 4th and Central. Don't quote me on it, where you could get your allotment of sacramental wine. The way it works gets a little fuzzier. Essentially, a rabbi would make up a list of congregants and how much each congregant could have of wine. And he could either provide that congregant with the wine himself, or with the right paperwork, send the congregant to the distiller. I mean, not to the distiller, to the dealer, which was a nearby dealer in Cincinnati. And you would make a withdrawal from this distiller, this distributor. The tricky part was the exchange of money. The exchange of money with clergy was considered so distasteful that, and this is in the federal requirements, that congregants were not supposed to receive a bill from either the congregation or from the wine distributor for the wine. You were supposed to make a donation to the congregation, a general donation for what you thought it was worth. So, as you could imagine, the possibilities, because there's no accounting, there's no direct accounting, the possibilities to make money and to bootleg are just
sky high,
ridiculous. And the other factor in this is, okay, Christianity, some Protestant denominations, Catholicism, pretty much all of the sacramental wine, I guess you could say all of it, is used in church. Judaism, almost all of it is used in the home. big. Now, that's not to say that there weren't sacramental wine scandals in churches. There were, but it was much easier to get away with things within the Jewish world. Okay. So in short order, the conservative and reform movements see that this is not going to be good for the Jews, because the level, the opportunity to break the law is just, it's sky high. Yeah. So in short order, they tell their congregants, drink grape juice. It's totally acceptable. Not to oversimplify, but within Jewish law, within halakha, the rabbinic, if there is such a thing, the rabbinic consensus is wine is preferred, but grape juice is acceptable. The Reform and conservative rabbis are trying also to get the Orthodox rabbis to go along with this, and they won't. They will not go along with this. If anything, they dig in, and there are prominent Orthodox rabbis of this time period saying grape juice is not acceptable, even though it could be. Plus the fact that the government has told us we can drink wine, so why would we not drink wine?
Yeah.
The Reform and conservative rabbis and leadership were very concerned that this would kind of up the anti-Semitism that Jews were experiencing in this country anyway, and they were absolutely right. There probably was no religious or ethnic group that wasn't involved in bootlegging, but certainly the Jews were. And those who hated us absolutely wrote about this. Henry Ford did. The Klan was, used this as fuel to their fire, as it were. Orthodox rabbis, you've got a few things going on. First of all, you've got these prominent umbrella organizations for conservative and reform rabbis. That really doesn't exist for Orthodox rabbis. There's an Orthodox union, but there are so many Orthodox rabbis that are not a part of this umbrella or that umbrella. And the other feeling is that I've garnered is, okay, look, those who are going to hate us anyway. We're allowed to do this. Why wouldn't we do this? But what pops up, and Marnie gets into this a lot, is you've got rabbis who are becoming bootleggers. You've got rabbis who are selling their certification to bootleggers. You've got people who are not rabbis, who have nice Irish names, who are all of a sudden saying they're rabbis. It's hard to prove who is and who is not a rabbi when you don't have a major umbrella for your particular denomination. So it's like, go prove it. So this leads to the sacramental wine scandals of the 1920s, where I believe it was 1925 or 1926. You'll have to read my next book because it's in there, the exact year. There's a raid in New York that brings in, I think it's 400 rabbis for overinflating the number of their congregants. So, and then there
did anything like that happen in Dayton or Cincinnati?
Not specifically with rabbis. What I know is that there was a wine committee, at least the minutes say there was a wine committee at House of Abraham in the 1930s, and they mentioned the rabbi who was responsible for providing wine for the congregation. Now, that's not to say that every rabbi was a bootlegger, but it was happening, it was plenty happening. And then the rabbi at B'nai Yeshurun, which would become Temple Israel, Rabbi Meyerberg, he's a great speaker and a superb writer. And at the time, even though he's here in Dayton, he is one of the editors of the Ohio Jewish Chronicle, which is based in Columbus, although at that point it really was covering much of the state. And he writes editorials railing against the use of wine, that, we should not drink wine. What will they think of us? And he's really passionate about that. So, that's going on at the same time. There was a Jewish family here. I don't think they were prominent, but it was a husband, wife, and son who were brought in on federal liquor raids in 1927. I was not able to follow through if they were put in jail. Oftentimes people weren't put in jail necessarily. They were taken in and, just kind of to set an example. But yeah, it was a husband, wife, and a son. That was the closest I found to specific, put my finger on Jewish bootleggers. They must have been really bad bootleggers to get caught. So probably the ones who were really good just never got caught, or
could be.
Got their way out of it. So we're going to go quickly back to our friend Raoul. in the middle of the 1920s, Ralph shows up in the Dayton City Directory, and it says that he is now in the non-alcoholic beer business. That's basically near beer, which has a very low alcohol content. So the question is whether he's producing real beer under the guise of of near beer. It's hard to tell. But what happens is there were a number of breweries in Dayton that go way back, well over a century, and before Prohibition comes, they can see the handwriting on the wall that this is coming. They combine into one organization. And because of Prohibition they all end up closing down except for one brewery. And at that point, they switch to near beer, and they bring Rao in to run that business. So that's how he kind of stays afloat. After the Prohibition is over, there's a consortium from Cleveland of brewers that happen to be Jewish that come in, and they kind of buy their way into this organization. And it's unclear. At first, they want to work with Rao, but it's unclear whether Rao just says forget it, or if they push him out at some point. There's some indication that the police enforcement is not happy with this syndicate from Cleveland, that there might be something not clean about them. So, that's basically as far as the Jews go in kind of the liquor business in this town.
All right. So now that we got past Prohibition and the Depression, anything interesting that really stands out to you from World War II in the Jewish community of Dayton?
Yeah, actually, yes. A member of the Jewish community here, born and raised in Dayton, member of Beth Abraham congregation. And I'll show you his picture. Robert Nathan. He chaired the U.S. War Production Board, the planning committee, beginning in 1942. He was Franklin Roosevelt's guy when it came to mobilizing all industry in this country for World War II. And after the war, he was a consultant to presidents, even to the state of Israel. And I'll show you a picture of Robert Nathan. He was a young man. I think he was 33 when FDR hired him to mobilize for the war effort. And you can see, even at 33, there he is with his pipe. He looks very, very astute. And so really the war mobilization effort was him. He was the guy who made it happen. And he was, he was one of us. Another person, and this is reaching beyond World War II, Ted Levitt. And I'll show you some pictures from my book as well. Ted Levitt, his family escaped Germany in 1935 and settled in Dayton, and he went to high school here. He worked as a copy boy for the Dayton Daily News, goes to Antioch, but eventually he becomes one of the most celebrated economists at the Harvard Business School, and he is the editor of the Harvard Business Review, and he's the guy who coins the term globalization. So this is his sister's still here in Dayton, but Ted Levitt is on top. He's the guy leaning back in his chair at Harvard. So he's another guy, famous guy. We also have, and this is a shared story. Now I'm reaching way back. We're going back to the 1880s here. This is a shared gentleman who lived in Cincinnati and then moved up to Dayton. And since you've got plenty of Cincinnati people there, I'm sure, who are residents, this story may be familiar to them. This is the story of Gus Lindeman. I will show you a picture of Gus. This is Gus in probably the late 1870s. Look at that hair. He was a natty dresser. Okay. So he comes from the ilk of German Jews who kind of make their way to Cincinnati. In the 1860s, he's listed as a bartender. He's got a little bar. But in the 1870s, he probably becomes the most celebrated caterer in Cincinnati. Not specifically like for Jews, although he is catering for it's the Alamania Club in Cincinnati, which is the club of the German Jews, very prominent club. But he's probably Cincinnati's most celebrated caterer overall. And he is the caterer. He will be the caterer for the Treifa banquet. So this is a mystery of history, as it were. Isaac Mayer Weiss, who's the architect of Reform Judaism, he is trying to achieve he's trying to build a fairly broad umbrella to unify all of American Jewry, all the congregations. He's the architect of Reform Judaism, but he's really hoping to bring everybody under kind of the fold. So it's the 10th anniversary of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. So that was 1873. It's now 1883. And it's also the very first ordination of the first rabbinic students from Hebrew Union College. So this is a famous story. Weiss invites all the great Jewish leaders of the day, all the great rabbis of the day, to converge on Cincinnati for this twofold celebration. And they come, they show up. He is on the very edge, it would seem, of uniting American Jewry. It looks that way anyway. People they're having a good time. They've really gotten a lot out of meeting with this small class of now rabbis. And then the celebration after the ordination, which is the beautiful Plum Street Temple, is at and I guess at the time it was a restaurant and an inn on Mount Adams called the Highland House. I think there's still some business that's a direct successor to the Highland House up on Mount Adams today. So my guess on this one is they probably would have used the German Jewish Club for the celebration, the Alemania, except that at this point, there was a point when Gus Lindemann was their caterer. At this point, he's technically not with them. He's out on his own. So the celebration is held at the Highland House, and the guests are taking cable cars. They're taking cable cars up to Mount Adams to the Highland House. And when they get there, this is when they are served a treifa meal. And when we say treifa, non-kosher, we're talking about every possible violation of kashrut except for one, and that would be pork. And this is really, if you look at the way that, there's no one way that German Reform Jews would have eaten, but in Cincinnati, in those days, at that time, you can see the menus that Gus had prepared for the German Jewish Club at the Alemania. They're using every kind of treif, except they draw the line, they're not eating pork. Okay. So too, this is the meal that's served. Essentially, at this point, there are kind of two camps of rabbis in America, and the titles are vague. You've got the reformers, who are those who seem to be leaning toward or are already adhering to Reform Judaism. And then those who aren't, there are bunches of terms that are used for them interchangeably. Sometimes they're called the traditionalists. Sometimes they're called the Orthodox or Orthodoxy. Sometimes they're called conservative. These terms are all used. So basically, it's the reformists and the traditionalists, more or less. So the traditionalists, they're horrified, they're shocked, they get up, they won't eat it. In the meantime, Weiss still thinks it was kind of a success, sort of ish, and that's how he reports on it in his paper. And the local Cincinnati papers, or the general papers, are reporting on it that way. The goal of Weiss and his leadership at the time, they certainly want to show that Cincinnati is not a backwater, that it is cosmopolitan, that it's sophisticated. The menu for this, which is printed and it's got the beautiful plumage on the edges, it's in French, but it's like really bad French. Nevertheless, what happens is a lot of those who are unhappy, these rabbis, go back to their communities and they talk about how horrible it was, and they're writing about it in the Jewish press, and there are even accounts in general press. One of the rabbis from Baltimore, his daughter is Henrietta Sold, and she writes a piece in one of the papers. She'll be the founder of Hadassah someday. First of all, how does this thing go so wrong? How? There's a few possibilities. Could Isaac Mayer Weiss have made an error in judgment? Could it have been the committee of prominent Jews in Cincinnati who made the error? Could it have been Gus who screwed up this thing? Well, the way it plays out, Weiss has two newspapers. He's got the American Israelite, which at that point is not really a local newspaper. It's really for the entire Jewish America. Jewish America. It's a champion of Reform Judaism. But in that paper, he first says, bear with me, I want to make sure I get this right.
Sure.
He first says that Lindemann acted on his own.
Really?
That he made the mistake. And then in Die Deborah, which is his German language paper, he blames the committee. But then
not willing to take responsibility.
Well, Jonathan Sarna has written about this, that Weiss is not the kind of guy to say I made a mistake. He's not the kind of guy to make a mistake. He understands kashrut. If anything, his wife comes from an Orthodox background and keeps a kosher kitchen. But eventually he realizes the pressure is mounting. This is not going away. And he digs his heels in. And then he lashes out very publicly saying, it's ridiculous that we are concerned about these primitive strictures and kitchen Judaism. And it's absurd that, that we keep these laws, which of course kind of leads to the schism, the absolute, if there was ever any hope of one united Judaism in America, which there probably never was anyway, this is absolutely like leading to the break. So 2 years later, in 1885, the Reform movement codifies the Pittsburgh Platform, which, among other things, kind of eschews the laws of kashrut as primitive and not having meaning, and embracing the moral laws of Judaism, but not the ritual laws. A few years later, the Orthodox, conservative, traditional start Jewish Theological Seminary, which at that point is not conservative, distinct from Orthodox. It's all one and the same. And ultimately, a few years later, the seminary is going to go a little bit more liberal, and the Orthodox will kind of go out on their own within the Orthodox Union. We know, would there have been these separate movements of Judaism had it not been for this banquet? Of course there would have.
Yes.
But, just like the Wright brothers, would there have been an airplane if it wasn't for the Wright brothers? Of course there would have. But this is how it happened, and this is where it happened. So the best answer that I think there is out there, and I don't pretend to be a scholar on this, but based on Sarna and Zola and the others on this, it was a mistake.
Really?
This is not something that would have been intentional. Why would Weiss invite all of these people to build a broad coalition and then slap them in the face with this? That it seems that either the local committee of Reformed Jews, they thought this would be fine because that's the way they ate, or Lindemann himself, okay, this is how the Jews eat here. So the thought that Weiss would have deliberately done this, it's like cognitive dissonance. It could have happened, but it's so hard to imagine why he would do this, to slap them in the face and destroy what he had hoped to do.
Yeah.
Mistake lies elsewhere. And it was an honest to goodness mistake. Maybe it was a mistake on his part of not micromanaging. But so Gus, basically, Gus is doing well. This does not bring him down in any way at all. He's still doing well in Cincinnati. And then in the 1890s, he just moves up to Dayton and becomes the head steward of the Dayton Club here, which is not a Jewish club at all. It's a Gentile club. I don't even know if they admit Jews. But he's got such a great reputation, so he stays with them. Eventually, he opens his own little restaurant. Gets destroyed in the flood, so he goes back into catering, and he dies in the 1920s. But and he was a very celebrated caterer here. He was on I guess there was a national board of stewards. Steward had a much more prestigious meaning back in the day. Basically, it was like the catering manager. And he opened a chapter in Dayton. But the story doesn't kind of end there, because he has granddaughters that are sisters, Hermine and Josephine, and they become brilliant ballet dancers. And they found the Dayton Ballet, which is the second oldest ballet company in the country. Then a step beyond that, indirectly, they help with the birth of Dayton Contemporary Dance Company, which is one of the leading African-American dance companies in the country. In the 1940s, the mothers of girls in the African-American community, they come to the Schwartz sisters, who have a dance studio. They want their girls to learn to dance. They want the best for them. And the Schwartz sisters are the best. The Schwartzes very directly say, we would love to have you dance in our studio if we had your girls dancing in our studio, our business would be closed. What we're going to do is let's open another studio where we'll come to you. And that's what they do for about a generation until one of the leading dancers in that studio takes over. Her name is Geraldine Blunden. And then she forms the Dayton Contemporary Dance Company, which is just amazing. If you've never seen it, it is up there with Alvin Ailey, just phenomenal company. So, the reality is that they do what they can at the time. By the 1960s, the sisters, the Schwartz sisters, their dance school is fully integrated. So they are, they go as far as they think they can at the times, but their reach is still here in Dayton today.
Wow. Any particular things to note about the founding of the state of Israel, or anything in the latter half of the 20th century?
Well, I'll tell you, we put it on the cover of our book here.
Oh yeah. So
right.
What is
that
it?
is Golda Meir.
Ah.
And these are two prominent leaders in Dayton. And when the state of Israel was established and when the Arab armies surrounding Israel attacked, at that very moment, Golda, who was, her name at that point was Golda Meyerson. She hadn't shortened it to sound Israeli. She was going from city to city to city in the United States to raise money for the fledgling state. I think she went to about 40 cities. And the fact that she chose to come to Dayton, which was a much smaller city, but when it came to campaign dollars was punching way above its weight, speaks volumes. So she spoke at the Biltmore Hotel downtown. And, this was Golda getting the check from the campaign, for the emergency campaign. It's not the best picture in the world, but it's the most historic picture of anything in Dayton. And it's an important picture. But it also shows, my sense is she looks exhausted. She's going from city to city to city. I mean, she almost looks like, give me the check so I can go to the next city. But so, Golda was here. And over the years, when we've done stories about the history of Israel, I've interviewed people who were at that dinner. I've interviewed their kids who weren't at the dinner, but who sat on the steps when Golda was in their home visiting them, and, things of that ilk. So it's very inspiring. And in my office, I've got pictures of Golda when she was here in Dayton. She was here. What I've noticed is when Israelis come to Dayton, Golda was here. Yes, she was here. She was absolutely here in Dayton.
Wow.
For sure.
That's really great. It's really great. Anything else from the latter half of the 20th century of note?
One of the more unusual stories happens. This happened probably 2 months before I arrived here. This is November of 1995. People might remember at that time the Dayton Peace Accords were taking place here. They were out at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
It really was actually in Dayton.
Yes, it absolutely was. Why was it in Dayton? Richard Holbrooke, who was the chief negotiator for Clinton, decided we are going to do this in Dayton, Ohio. It was held at a hotel on the campus of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The hotel, by the way, is the Hope Hotel, which is a very inspirational name, Hope. But it's actually, what's interesting is it's named after Bob Hope, who did so much to entertain the troops for so many years. The reason that Holbrooke chose Dayton, because it was out of the media spotlight. Do it in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles. There's no national media here on a regular basis. You're doing it sequestered on an air base in Dayton. It's just you and the negotiators on all sides in a room.
Wow.
And no one else. So what happens, I think it's the fourth day of the negotiations, which did kind of stop the fighting in the Balkans. It's certainly not, it hasn't been a perfect peace, but it's been a peace and it stopped the fighting. I think it's the third or fourth day of the Dayton Peace Accords when Rabin is assassinated.
Oh, wow.
And just like so many communities around the country, within a day, I think Rabin was assassinated. I know we found out about it here was on Shabbat. So it must have been Motzi Shabbos in Israel that evening. So everybody that next day, Sunday, held their memorial services for Rabin. And I'm sure it was the same in Cincinnati. So in Dayton, one of the rabbis got the idea, why don't we invite the negotiators for the peace accords? What do we have to lose? So it was an assistant rabbi from Temple Israel who calls the base, asks to be put through to the negotiators, and is put through.
Wow.
I mean, I could see that happening in maybe like 1911 or something, but so they invite the negotiators to the memorial service, and many of them show up.
Oh, wow.
Fortunately, Slobodan Milosevic did not show up, but I think his second in charge showed up. It was a lot of the second guys. Holbrook is there. General Wesley Clark is there. And those who were speaking, the rabbis who were speaking, really make a point to hammer home that, Rabin gave his life for peace, for real peace. And this was a message to the negotiators. And afterwards, when people were invited, anybody was invited who wanted to come onto the bima and kind of sing some songs of hope. Could I tell you what they sang? No, I'll have to find out for my next book. But there are negotiators up there from all sides. Richard Holbrook is up there. It's not the best photo, but nevertheless, there's a photo. Oh, wow. So all these things are kind of coming together in Dayton, Ohio at the time. And
that's really neat. And how far into the book, into history? I mean, do you cover much of the time since you've been in there the last quarter century?
I really, with the first book, I stopped in the year 2000. I figured that I'm a little too close to more recent history, that it needs some more distance to really give it perspective.
Yeah.
In the second book, the closest I get, the last chapter is about Black-Jewish relations from the riots that were beginning in 1966. There were terrible riots here in Dayton, as there were in so many cities around the country. So it covers the period starting with the riots and then kind of goes through when Dayton desegregated. So roughly from around 66 until maybe the early 80s. And then it looks back at what worked and what didn't work. So it doesn't really come up to the moment, but at the very end, it's people in the present day kind of looking back at what didn't work. And to me, it's startling how many things didn't work then are still not working today. Issues of social justice and racial inequity and prejudice, and issues that, of course, should have been solved by now that just have been spinning for all these years. And, the aspiration, the hope that maybe this time people will really get to work on this. So that's,
oh, wow.
And then I guess in another generation, somebody will write the history of how this all came out.
Yeah. Wow. It's really incredible. So throughout the project, are there any particular unique highlights about Dayton as far as the Jewish community and its history?
Well, there is two things I'll touch on. First of all, in the 1970s, the Dayton Jewish Chorale was something very unique and very special. It was the youth chorale. It was Beth Abraham Congregation's youth chorale was unique and special in our community. At the time, he was the cantor of Beth Abraham, cantor Jerome Kopmar. His philosophy was he wanted the best singers so that he could shape them to be the best youth chorale. At the time, and I mean, such is the case with so many youth chorales, anybody who auditions gets in, and that's one way of educating people. He would only take what he thought were people with the best voices from across the Jewish community. And because of that quality, and believe me, politically, that wasn't easy, but because of that quality, and every year he was a composer himself, he still is, he would compose new pieces or commission new pieces for the chorale, and they did several recordings. They would tour nationally. They toured Israel. They performed for prime ministers in Israel. And let me just show you a few pictures of the chorale. And again, it was open to any kids in the community from the Jewish community. You can kind of see it there, who could sing. If you couldn't sing, that was another story. But the climax of the chorale.
Hold on. Yeah, right.
Sure.
Not much. Well, and then I'm going to head out and try to get out.
Oh, to go to see it.
Yeah. Sure. Thank you. All right.
But really, kind of the apex, the climax of the chorale is in 1982, Cantor Kopmar invites the great operatic tenor, albeit he's older in years, Jan Pierce, come to Dayton and sing a concert with the chorale. And he sends Pierce recordings. Pierce can hear the quality of these kids. So what happens is this performance, it ends up, this was Jan Pierce's last performance, the final performance of his career was in Dayton with the Dayton Jewish Chorale. The album was released after that, and he dies 2 years later. So this is, you can see Jan Pierce and his wife and Cantor Koopmar and Koopmar's wife in Dayton, and there's the subsequent album that came out. And what Pierce actually said at the concert was really meant a lot to people. Pierce was praising the kids, and he says, "These children are not your average kids singing Yankee Doodle. They are professionals." So
wow.
It was, yeah. And that's something that was very specific and unique to Dayton. And oftentimes when I'll speak to people from other Jewish communities, people who work in Jewish communities, rabbis, professionals who have been in their communities for a long time, first thing that they'll say when they hear Dayton is, "Oh, the youth chorale. That was amazing. Wow. That was incredible." It's to this day. And every few years they'll do a reunion. They'll come together and they'll sing with Cantor Koopmar, and it's touching. It's really sweet to see.
Oh, wow.
So.
You said there were two things. That was one, right?
There's always another thing, right?
Yeah.
The other thing was, and this is not well known outside of Dayton. Let me find a picture to go with this. I don't know if these pictures are translating or not. Should I hold them up a little better?
It's still
I guess
work.
I could have done a screen share, right? That would have been better. I'm sorry.
This works fine.
Okay. So there's a little bit of a story to this. Back in, hopefully most of your the residents down there know that Dayton is the home of the Wright brothers. That aviation started here. Not in South Carolina. They flew there because of the high winds and the soft landings on the sand. So, what did they have? First in flight?
Yeah, first flight.
Right.
You're the birthplace.
We know. Well, one of the Wright brothers was born in Indiana, but they were raised here. And this is where they did all their research and everything else. So in 2003, it was the centennial of flight. And of course, Dayton was getting ready for, big to-dos. Probably a year before, in 2002, I got a call from Israel's postal authority that they wanted to honor the Wright brothers in 2003 with a centennial commemorative stamp to the Wright brothers.
Oh, wow.
But they wanted to make sure that they weren't anti-Semites like Thomas Edison or Henry Ford. What could I tell them? What do I know?
Yeah.
And actually, I think they checked with Jonathan Sarna too. It might have been Sarna or Gary Zola. So we started looking around, and I mean, I'd never heard of anything one way or the other, really. And I had a freelancer here who really loved history, and he started looking into it. What we found out was the Wright brothers weren't anti-Semites. In fact, the first pilot that they trained and hired to be a teacher in their flight school, who was also the first pilot they hired as an exhibition pilot, was Jewish. Not only was he Jewish, but he was a staunch Zionist.
Oh, wow.
And his name is Arthur Welsh. In aviation circles, he's well known. In Dayton, since we did this story about him back in the Centennial Flight, people know him. In Washington, D.C., he's pretty well known too. This is Arthur Welsh, known as Al Welsh, sitting on a Wright plane. And he was born in the Ukraine. He was born in Kiev, raised in Philadelphia, and then Washington, D.C. He is the first known Jewish airplane pilot. We know of no Jewish airplane pilots before him. I mean, after all, the Wright brothers invented the airplane.
Right.
But I've also, as so many people who love Jewish history have been cautioned by the Jonathan Sarna, be careful when you say the first, because there might be somebody before. We know that the first known Jewish aviator, there were no airplanes, but Otto Lilienthal was a German Jew who flew with like glider wings. So, but he was still Jewish anyway. But Welsh, I guess he's wounded in I forget what it was. He's in the hospital with something, and he reads about the Wright brothers, and he decides this is what he wants to do with his life. He wants to be a pilot. When the only pilots right now, really, it's like Orville and Wilbur. Maybe like one or two French people like Curtis. So he writes to the Wright brothers, I want to work for you. And they reject him several times. He comes to Dayton and meets with the Wright brothers, I think at least once. And because of his persistence, they accept him. So it's 1910, I believe it is. Let me see. 1910, he goes to work with the Wright brothers. He learns to fly from them. Again, he's their first exhibition pilot. He's the first person to be certified as a teacher of pilots for the Wright brothers.
Oh, wow.
And he's known as like the most safe, the most cautious, the most careful. He's also friends with millionaires because the only people who can afford to fly at that point are military who are contracting the Wright brothers for planes. Yeah. And millionaires who are just like, it's a hobby. Oh, teach me to fly, that kind of thing. I've seen documentation that in these parties with millionaires, he dutifully kept kosher. He wasn't eating.
Oh, wow.
But what happens with these guys, the very first flyers, and it's very sad, but it's the reality. Most of these guys died in plane accidents because this was new and it was fairly dangerous. And quite honestly, the Wright brothers planes, other planes surpassed them in terms of stability. Unfortunately, the Wright brothers spent so much time litigating the patents on their current technology that they really didn't actively pursue revising and refining technology. Another part of that is that Orville is left on his own because Wilbur dies in 1912. And Wilbur kind of seems to have been the real engineer, of the operation. So Welsh is flying a plane. He's testing a plane for the Army, and he's got a lieutenant from the Army with him as a passenger. And they're testing, how it's doing, like raising up with certain weight loads and diving down. And on the downswing, they never come out of it. And he and the lieutenant there, they're killed immediately. This is out at College Park, Maryland. This is 2 weeks after Wilbur's death.
Oh,
wow. But even so, Orville Wright and the sister Catherine Wright, they take the trip to Washington. Remember, he's, he had lived in Washington previously. The woman he married was a member of the Washington Jewish community, Adas Israel. So Orville and Catherine come to the funeral, which is at Adas Israel, and they're consoling his wife. And the wife there's an infant daughter. And unfortunately, that's where, Welsh's stories end, as does so many of those early flyers. But when we found this out, of course, the guy who found this information for me, Bob Thumb is his name, he wrote a story about it and kind of brought this back to, it's not like it was hidden. People knew about it at the time, but since all those years later, people forgot about it. So we even tracked down his daughter was still alive, Aileen, living in England. She was about 100 years old.
Wow.
And he was able to interview her for this. We were able to let the Israeli Postal Authority know, no, it's cool.
Wow.
It's cool. And in 2003, they did put out commemorative stamps to honor the Wright brothers.
That's really wonderful.
Now, what I will say is, when it comes to issues of prejudice, certainly in those times, there's no one person that probably passes the purity tests of 2021. We did find some instances where the Wrights were what one would call parlor anti-Semites.
Okay.
Nothing like a Henry Ford, nothing like a Thomas Edison, but Catherine in particular, there's documentation of letters that she wrote where she would disparage different Jewish people. The Wrights, the business agent in France was Jewish. Hartberg was his name. And there were times when she would disparage him for being a Jew.
Oh, wow.
The Wright brothers themselves, she also comments in a letter to somebody, I think it was to her father, the bishop, after the funeral, that Arthur Welsh, their pilot, didn't act or look as Jewish as so many of his family members acted and looked.
Oh, wow.
So that was another one, parlor anti-Semite. And then one that I only just recently found out a few years ago. There's a famous, the Wright brothers' home, the house that they built, which it's in Oakwood, Ohio. It's in Oakwood, just south of Dayton, which for many years was an exclusive community. Only white, mainly Protestants could live there. So this was the home that the Wrights planned for themselves, their sister Catherine, and the father Milton. Wilbur died before they could actually move into it, but the rest of the family lived there until Orville died in 1948. Big home on a hill. It's called Hawthorne Hill. So before they bought the land for that home, they had bought land north of Dayton in an area that was just starting to become a bit Jewish. And that was one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons they decided not to go with that land, to sell that land and to buy into Oakwood. There was a letter that one of the Wright brothers wrote to the other that, oh, a home on that block that we're building in just sold, and I'm afraid that, it might be bought by one of our more conspicuous Hebrew friends. So that's something that definitely out there. Having said that, their agent in France was Jewish. Orville was on the board of the library for this particular community, Oakwood, for many years with a member of the Jewish community, one of the very few Jews to actually live in Oakwood. And they probably became as friendly as Orville let anybody in. Orville and Wilbur, these guys had classic engineers' personalities. They weren't particularly social. They didn't hang. They didn't have friends because all they could think of was engineering and what they were doing. And, that's the kind of people that they were. So it's a mixed bag. And actually what I go into in the next book are how members of our Jewish community in different time periods kind of interweave and navigate with prominent members of the Dayton community who aren't necessarily Jewish. And it's amazing how much positive there was, even in instances where there was prejudice, but to some extent, the non-Jews did work with Jews when they had to, when they liked us. So it's a lot of, there's not much black and white. It's a lot of gray. It's a lot of nuance. I delve very extensively into that book, into John H. Patterson, who is the founder, owner of National Cash Register and also National Cash Register and the city of Oakwood and the Jews. In many surprising ways, he worked with the Jewish community, but in other ways, he was pretty restrictive as well. So that subtle history has been lost. And the Jewish community here tends to remember Patterson as an anti-Semite to an extent, but there's a lot more to this story. There's much nuance, and that'll play a big part in my book.
Marshall Weiss, thank you so much. This was really great. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your knowledge, and your time on this topic.
It's a pleasure. This was much fun. Drew, thank you for inviting me. And when this whole COVID thing is over, it'd be my pleasure to come down to Cincinnati and meet with everybody and share more stories and hopefully hear your stories and learn a lot of things that I didn't know.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Well, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much.
You too.